Welcome to the making of Rewilding, the folk horror anthology of 3 stories now streaming on Prime. I'm the director, Ric Rawlins, and let's start by going behind the scenes on the writer's Enquiry. In winter 2019, I visited a small theatre called the Rondo to see a production of Hound of the Baskervilles. Playing Watson that night was Richard Chivers, and I took Rich out for a drink a few nights later to ask him if he thought we could make a film. He not only said yes, but he also told me who the great local actors were in Bath, and which ones were probably a bit crazy and best to avoid. At the same time, I was working in a small English village called Newton St Low, and it was very pretty. I would walk around on my lunch breaks, getting inspired by the countryside. The village ended up being our primary location, and it's only in retrospect that I've sort of considered that because the village is owned by King Charles, we probably should have asked permission. Storyboards were drawn up during the long COVID lockdowns, and as soon as we were allowed outside to film, we started. So the writer's Enquiry went before the cameras in October 2020. This first scene was the cult sacrifice at the end of the film. Apologies if that's a spoiler. And the evil cult, it was supposed to have about 20 members, but due to COVID restrictions, we could only have about 6 instead, so the cult became a bit more cultish than I perhaps had anticipated. We arrived early in the morning to dig Rich's grave, and it probably won't surprise you to hear that he is not buried vertically. He was actually lying down fairly horizontally with a wooden sheet over the top upon which we placed the soil. I was petrified that this wooden sheet would somehow decapitate Rich, so we did have to proceed carefully. It was around this time that we realised the farmer hadn't told his workers what we were up to, so these 2 lads came out in a tractor and they just stared at us, not really knowing what the hell was going on. Next up, we were on to the dialogue sequences, which filmed around Bath with local actors Louise Wallace and Nadine Kumber, both of whom let us film in their actual homes. Louise lives literally on a canal, so that was a beautiful place to be. The writer's Enquiry features a lot of shots of Rich ferreting about in Newton St Low, walking between houses, walking over hills, driving between valleys, ferreting about in the graveyard, and of course meeting Luke Smith, who plays the musical hobo. So it felt like almost a year went by where I was just phoning Rich all the time saying, let's go to this weird little village, and we started getting a bit of deja vu. Luke delivered a great song for his sequence though, and the shots were finally finished about a year after we began. Because the writer's Enquiry was the first story that we shot, I think for that reason it sort of most resembles the sort of classic folk horror influences of things like The Wicker Man, and has those tropes of the outsider being ensnared in a kind of rural village trap. And almost that's what makes it some people's favourite story. But I think no matter which story people prefer, it's always going to be that ending where Rich is pumpkinised, that people will probably remember the morning after. The family tree was inspired by an author called Algernon Blackwood, who wrote a story called The Man Whom the Trees Loved. It's about a man who becomes obsessed with forest just outside his garden, and this inspired me to think about trees as living entities and how there might be something a bit spooky in that concept. In the family tree we have an author writing a book about Britain's strangest trees, which naturally leads her into trouble. Filming took place over the summer of 2021, and we shot this one the fastest, over 3 days, with a few effects sequences shot afterwards. Natasha Neckles plays the lead role as the author, and she's staying in this Airbnb, which we filmed in a box. You can't tell in the film, but we were shooting on a farm, and there's actually a goose who was making goose noises a lot while we were shooting. So that was something to deal with in the sound mix. David Pearl plays the book's illustrator, Cardwell, and really the film is centred around his friendship with Lara. And David brought with him a very fast sports car, and I have fond memories of him driving from Box to where we were sleeping in Bath, driving somewhere near the top of the speed limit. The forest was our second main location, and that was Lee Woods in Bristol. The previous October, I'd scouted many forests for a haunted-looking tree and found a brilliant ancient oak, which looked really terrifying. The only problem was I hadn't anticipated that we would be filming in the summer, so when we returned, the tree looked a bit more friendly now that it had leaves on. Lee Woods in the summer is a truly atmospheric forest though, and probably the trickiest thing we did there was shooting the exorcism scene until about 2 a.m. Members of the shoot, myself included, would frequently get lost in the darkness of the forest trying to find our way back to the car for a spare battery or whatever. Once the main shoot was finished, we had the effects shot of the eyeball, which you see on the poster, and that was done a few weeks later with a really talented hair and makeup artist called Francis de Havas. It required the production assistant, Christoph Alexander, who saved my life on many occasions, to lie down under some specially prepared bark. Then when it came to the shot of his tongue catching drips of blood, he had to wear a wooden mask, which became increasingly gnarly the more we used it. So I will be endlessly thankful to him for enduring that experience. The music of the family tree was performed almost in one improvised session by the sitar player Nathan Morgan. Nathan is a true folk horror and nature enthusiast, and he knows how to conjure that atmosphere with his amazing music. The family tree required more props than any other film in Rewilding, and thankfully I've got a friend called Emily Perrin who I went to university with. She runs Make, Play, Do, and she created 3 books for this film. You've got an ancient log of death records, which we see in the church. You've got a book about folk history, which Lara and Cardwell discover in their accommodation. And of course the final book, the most important one I suppose, Britain's Strangest Trees. We filmed this particular shot of the book in a shop window at a fantastic independent bookshop in Bath called Mr. B's Emporium. But then when it came to the shot of Lara and Cardwell looking at it, the sort of wide shot, I think we just used Waterstones for that one. I don't think we told Waterstones that actually, so please don't sue me, Waterstones. By the winter of 2021, Rewilding had completed filming on the first 2 of its folk horror stories, The Family Tree and The Writer's Enquiry, and ideas for its 3rd story were in development. Around this time, the folk horror magazine Hellbore released its Wild Gods issue, and one of its features told the true story of the sorcerer in the cave. The author, Anna Mylan, explained how in 1914 a mysterious cave painting was discovered in France that appeared to show a horned deity. The figure in the painting came to be known as the sorcerer and was the subject of a debate about whether this was evidence of an ancient pagan religion. Several other influences came together to form the inspiration for Stone Mothers, the Moomins being one, stories in which sea caves played an alluring and mysterious role. M.R. James stories also came into play with the trope of archaeology in folk horror, and also a book I'd been writing 3 years previously about music that had magical properties. After a long development process, the story for Stone Mothers had come together and the hunt for a sea cave began in Devon and Cornwall, with the final location being found on the west coast of the Gower. After seeing actor John Matthews play the role of the blind man in Frankenstein in a theatre production, the lead role of the film was written specifically with him in mind, and actors Georgina Palmer and Samantha Hudson came on board to play the troubled locals. Charles Doherty, an actor based in Newcastle who occasionally doubles for Mike Myers, presented a compelling audition for the role of Father Hallow, and when he came on board, the main cast was complete. Shooting finally began, and the sea cave shot took a couple of days to achieve. Key to our flexibility was Stephanie Pamplona's willingness to play 2 roles. She plays the troubled teenager in the opening sequence, then agreed to be covered in seaweed and wear horns to play the sea goddess as well in the film's finale. You probably wouldn't guess it, but there was just about an hour between filming those two sequences. Because the sea cave in the Gower is relatively small inside, we needed 2 stunt caves for the interiors. So firstly, John Matthews and I travelled to Avelin's Hole in Somerset. This cave had the required dimensions and atmosphere, but it was dangerous. It was dark and slippery inside with a treacherous decline, requiring us to wear protective headgear. Secondly, our sea cave needed wind holes, so production assistant Christoph Alexander and I travelled to Brown's Folly in Bath, where there's a cave, and very small torches were inserted into the cracks of the cave wall to create the effect. Subsequent shooting took place in Bath, with the sea digitally inserted in the background to match the geography of the Gower coastline, while the George and the Dragon pub kindly decorated their premises with their very own Christmas decorations to get the sort of seasonal vibes. The church shoot took place in St Mary's Church just outside of Bath in a village called Swainswick. And it was while we were here that some elderly ladies actually approached Charles, assuming he was a real priest, and asked him about the contents of the next service. Stone Mothers completed filming in March 2022, and owing to its coastal nature, it was decided that an accordion would be an appropriate lead instrument for its soundtrack. So after I wrote some of the melodies, they were performed quite beautifully by a musician called Karen Street. So that's a sort of potted history of Stone Mothers production. Obviously the film takes a look at the friction between Christianity and paganism in the UK, but I think also it's a celebration of the religions that we'll never know about, the ones that leave behind strange clues and artefacts, but ultimately are puzzles that will never be solved.